Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to the Brookings Institution. I'm John Allen, and I'm the president of Brookings. And I have the honor of opening today's Asia Transnational Threats Forum, the third of its kind, and the topic today is climate change in Asia. With climate change and global warming proceeding at an unprecedented rate, it's more important than ever to understand the climate security nexus. Namely, how climate change impacting lives and how it is shaping the security and strategic environment of Asia Pacific. This region, with its extensive coastlines, densely populated cities, and small island states, has suffered greater human and economic costs from climate disasters than any other region, and is very exposed to climate-related threats. Asia's coastal megacities and their growing populations are vulnerable to massive population displacement. That, coupled with the growing challenges of urbanization, regional security, insecurity, and inadequate responses and mitigation, climate change has the potential to significantly increase political instability and create security challenges. Severe droughts and loss of arable land can adversely affect economic activity, people's livelihoods, and food security as well. And in fact, this is already taking place. Furthermore, heightened competition for water and scarce natural resources is likely to compound violence and armed conflicts in the future. And in our military, in the United States military, we're already talking about the advent of resource wars. The sense of urgency to respond and to adapt to climate crises is shared by the vast majority of the global community. The European Parliament declared a climate emergency just last month, and last week the EU Commission adopted the European Green Deal. Nagano Prefecture in Japan has recently become the first state in East Asia to declare a climate emergency and promised to take action to address climate change. These are stories of success. What does climate leadership look like today in Asia more broadly, and how are the United States and its Asia-Pacific allies and partners responding to these climate-related challenges? Today we'll seek to answer some of these questions and to take a closer look at the region's vulnerabilities to climate-related threats and the actions that can and should be taken to manage and to mitigate and to respond to these challenges. We have a distinguished lineup of experts from the region to help us to discuss these challenges and these response measures. In particular, we're really deeply honored to have with us today Undersecretary General of the United Nations, Mrs. Otoi Kamanu, who will be delivering the keynote address. And Madam, you are most welcome here today at Brookings. And I look forward to hearing her remarks and the insightful and thought-provoking discussions that we'll have today in the aftermath. And finally, I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Korea Foundation for its support in making this conference possible. Very important work by a very important organization. Let me now turn the floor over to Jung Pak, our senior fellow and the SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies, to begin today's programming. And thank you for coming today.
Thank you, John, for that fantastic introduction. But it's also really hard to do public speaking after a general has gone, given he has a more authoritative, masterful delivery. So thank you, John, for joining us today. I know that this is one of your priorities, and this is one of Brookings' priorities. And thanks again to the Korea Foundation for making this happen and letting me not talk just about North Korea-related issues. So one of the best parts of my job is traveling and meeting people from different parts of the world. Last week, I was in Anchorage, Alaska, and it was my first time there to deliver a talk on North Korea. The people in Anchorage are very nervous because they see themselves as a likely threat or target for North Korean ballistic missiles, which are and they're the closest to North Korea from the U.S. perspective. So I packed my warmest and bulkiest winter coat, my winter boots, and a long scarf that I can wrap around my neck 5 times. Ladies, I know you know what I'm talking about. And I was expecting below freezing temperatures and slogging through deep, plush piles of snow. Instead, it was 40-something degrees, and there wasn't much fluffy snow on the ground, just fully plowed, very walkable sidewalks. So walkable that I didn't see very many boots like mine, but people were wearing high heels. And the sidewalks, if they were covered, they had some days-old packed ice, a thin layer of days-old packed ice. Yesterday, Anchorage reached a high of 45 degrees, breaking a 30-year-plus record. Villages in Alaska have already relocated at least once and will have to move again, that is, if they have the funds and the means to do so. Residents are worried about fishing and food supplies if the fish migrate for cooler waters. Civic leaders are worried about the erosion of permafrost and damages to infrastructure and how they would pay for it. They're also worried about the melting Arctic and what that might mean for resource competition, especially with China and Russia. One scientist said that it's not climate change, but climate changed. So I was in Anchorage to talk about North Korea, but it also served for me as a stark reminder of how much the present and future of the US is intricately linked with Asia, and how and the Arctic, and how climate change is requiring new frameworks on how we think about security and the necessity of immediate action. And new research has shown, as reported by the New York Times, has shown that 150 million people living on land will be below high tide by 2050, and that South Vietnam might be completely submerged underwater. Given the urgency, I am thrilled to have Ambassador and the Undersecretary General Utoika Manu as our keynote speaker. Ms. Utoika Manu, a Tongan national, took up her appointment as the High Representative for the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states back in May of 2017. Prior to taking up her position with the United Nations, she was the Chief Executive Officer of the Ministry of Tourism in Tonga. As the representative for countries most vulnerable to the climate emergency, especially the 38 small island developing states, Ambassador Utoika Manu has been at the forefront of climate leadership, advocating for expanded efforts to understand and respond to growing climate-related security risks. She has been driving efforts to help countries and multilateral organizations develop better frameworks to tackle the crisis and expanding opportunities for collaboration. And I so welcome Ambassador Utoika Manu to the podium to deliver her keynote.
Thank you. Mr. John Allen, President of the Brookings Institution, Dr. Jung Park, Senior Fellow, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to deliver the keynote address at this important event. I would like to express my sincere thanks to the Brookings Institution for inviting me to make this address. The issue of climate change and sea level rise has been a concern to small island developing states for more than 3 decades. A call for action was made in 1994 at the first global conference on the sustainable development of the small island states, and climate change and sea level rise were subsequently incorporated into the Barbados Plan of Action. Research and findings of the impact of climate change are now more prolific than in the 1990s. This prediction was clearly reflected in the language used in the BPOA, and I quote, "Global climate change may damage coral reefs, alter the distribution of zones of upwelling, and affected both subsistence and commercial fisheries. It may affect vegetation and saline intrusion, may adversely affect freshwater resources. The increased frequency and intensity of storm events that may result from climate change will also have profound effects on both the economies and the environment of SIDS. I've just returned from the 25th Climate Change Conference of Parties held in Madrid. At the opening of the conference, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres observed that the human species has been at war with the planet. Now the planet is fighting back. Climate change has escalated into a global climate emergency. The UN Environment Programme 2019 Emission Gap Report finds that we are on the brink of missing the opportunity to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. To limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we must collectively reduce emissions by 7.6% every year between 2020 and 2030. Based on today's commitments by governments, emissions are on track to reach 56 gigaton CO2 equivalent by 2030, which is over twice what they should be. The World Meteorological Organization's 2019 statement on the state of the global climate found that we are hitting new highs on key global warming indicators. Global atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases reached record levels in 2018, with carbon dioxide reaching 147% of pre-industrial levels. 2019 is likely to be the second or third warmest year on record. The past 5 years are now almost certain to be the 5 warmest years on record, and the past decade, 2010 to 2019, to be the warmest decade on record. In the fall of 2019, the global mean sea level reached its highest value since our earlier precise measurement. The World Meteorological Organization also reported that in September and October, we have seen record low sea ice both in the Arctic and Antarctic. In the first half of 2019, more than 10 million new internal displacements were recorded. 7 million of these were triggered by hydrometeorological events such as Cyclone Idai. Idai was one of the strongest known cyclones to make landfall on the east coast of Africa. It had a devastating impact on several countries, including Mozambique, as well as Malawi and Zimbabwe, landlocked developing countries, which up to now, had been spared from the impact of cyclones and hurricanes. At the end of August, Hurricane Dorian wreaked unprecedented damage in the Bahamas to the thousands of homes, infrastructure, and water resources, not to mention the loss of lives, wounded, and numerous people who are still unaccounted for. Initial damages were estimated at US $3.4 billion, equal to 1/4 of the nation's GDP. It was the second strongest Atlantic storm on record and the worst ever to strike the Bahamas. Dorian became the latest in now familiar pattern of devastating extreme weather events. Cyclone Pam, a Category 5 hurricane, struck Vanuatu in 2015. It is considered the worst natural disaster in the history of Vanuatu, with damages estimated at $692 million, equivalent to 64% of GDP. I was in Fiji in 2016 when the most intense cyclone in the southern hemisphere on record, Cyclone Winston, hit the Fiji Islands. 44 fatalities with damages estimated at $1.4 billion US dollars, equivalent to 33% of GDP, was also the costliest cyclone in the South Pacific Basin. In February last year, Cyclone Gita, also Category 5, struck my own native country of Tonga, with damages equivalent to 38% of GDP. The impacts of climate change are being felt across the globe. My office is responsible for advocacy in favor of the Small Island Developing States, or SIDS, Least Developed Countries, or LDCs, and the Landlocked Developing Countries, or LLDCs. They are among the most vulnerable countries on the planet. They are at the forefront of the impacts of climate change. The LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS in the Asia-Pacific region exhibit high vulnerability to climate impacts. The landlocked nations of Central Asia, the mountainous Himalayas, the highly exposed coastal LDCs such as Bangladesh, and the Pacific and Indian Ocean SIDS. Their national circumstances and specific constraints place them at the forefront of climate change, yet these countries have made the smallest historical contributions to global warming. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, special report on 1.5 degrees has highlighted the urgency to act now and to take major steps in order to avert catastrophic impacts. At 1.5 degrees Celsius, over 70% of coral reefs will die, but at 2%, virtually all reefs will be lost. The impacts of climate change will affect all nations, but will pose an existential threat to some SIDS. Indeed, SIDS are confronted with profound structural challenges and disadvantages related to their remoteness, small size, low-lying areas and risk of submersion, and extreme exposure to the ever more severe impacts of climate change. Responding to these challenges is made more difficult by limited institutional capacity and difficulties in accessing finance and resources, and compounded by a high degree of vulnerability to systemic shocks. The low per capita GNI in LDCs limits their ability to build resilience and respond to disasters. LLDCs are prone to desertification, while mountainous LLDCs suffer also from glacial lake outbursts, landslides, and flooding. All of these three groups of countries, the LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS, typically are commodity dependent or have narrow economic base, which further increases their overall fragility. High level of indebtedness place constraints on public sector resources available for investments in climate action and the other sustainable development goals. The impact of climate change reduces land availability, imperils food security, and exacerbates water scarcity. The impact of climate change reduces another possible impact is population being displaced or having to be relocated. My office and the International Migration Office launched a report in September titled Climate Change and Migration in Vulnerable Countries, a snapshot of LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS. The first of 11 recommendations for governments contained in the report is to acknowledge that climate change is a driver of migration, displacement, and planned relocation, and that human mobility can in turn have impacts on the environment. It is well recognized that sustainable development, peace, and security, and the respect of human rights and the rule of law are closely interlinked. And this has been reflected in the 2030 Agenda and its SDGs. Climate change as a threat multiplier has been universally recognized by the international scientific community in the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, as well as its impact on security. But with the rapidly accelerating impacts of climate change, it is becoming increasingly apparent that climate change is more than a threat multiplier, but a threat in itself. A threat to people, community, and nations, impacting not only on sustainable development, but on peace and security. This message was articulated in the strongest terms at the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Meeting in August in Tuvalu, where I had the honor to represent the UN Secretary General. Pacific leaders adopted the forum communique and the Kainaki II Declaration for Urgent Climate Change Action Now. This declaration, as well as the Bow Declaration adopted at last year's PIF's leaders meeting, places special emphasis on the security risks posed by climate change. Indeed, climate change poses an existential threat to low-lying or atoll SIDS. Sea level rise causes loss of land, reducing the amount available for agriculture. Ultimately, land loss will cause the disappearance of low-lying countries, which raises fundamental issues of sovereignty, state integrity, and national identity. Disruption to food and water resources can also make countries unviable. The very means of sustenance of island populations are under threat from climate change. For example, saltwater encroachment threatens their fragile and limited freshwater supplies. Global warming also impacts on the critical resources of fisheries, including the tuna, which are also important to Pacific SIDS. There's a growing evidence that increasing ocean temperatures affects nutrients, productivity, abundance, and migratory routes of tuna schools. And while foreign fleets can adapt to such changes, can be far more challenging for domestic fleets that are fishing in their own exclusive economic zones. In SIDS and coastal nations, extreme weather events damage vital infrastructure. Jetties make up an important part of the maritime transport infrastructure. Their destruction following a major hurricane or cyclone can take 3 years to rebuild. This poses direct threats to military and defense installations. Ocean acidification, rising sea levels, desertification, water shortages all threaten food security, increase competition for scarce resources, and eventually trigger the involuntary displacement of people. Furthermore, sea level rise causes communities in the Pacific to be relocated to higher ground. In the Solomon Islands, communities have had to abandon their homes in outlying islands to move to larger islands. In Papua New Guinea, they say that this is the first so-called climate refugees situation with relocation of the people in the Carteret Island, and also we've also had relocation in Fiji as well. And such examples pose challenging issues for the government and stakeholders on land tenure and ownership. If not carefully managed, these can cause social tensions and even conflict. International displacement or migration due to climate change impacts can cause new pressures or exacerbate existing ones, including between nations. To manage such challenges, we need to enhance our global governance arrangements through adaptive institutions, legal and policy measures, and call upon the leadership of all nations to act urgently. An issue that is receiving growing attention is the impact of sea level rise on the exclusive economic zones of small island states. The licensing of foreign fishing vessels in EEZs, especially where there's limited domestic capacity to exploit fisheries, bring in significant amounts of much-needed revenue. The international legal regime that grants maritime boundaries, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, does not explicitly address the question of the impact of sea level rise and how to treat the possible resulting loss in maritime zones from land loss upon which the boundaries are initially determined. Several SIDS have affirmed the permanency of their UNCLOS maritime boundaries, including EEZs in regional agreements and national legislation. Meanwhile, legal discussions are ongoing in the Sixth Committee of the UN General Assembly on whether the freezing of boundaries or maintaining of existing entitlements are permitted by UNCLOS, and if not, how could this be further articulated from a legal standpoint, either by way of a protocol to UNCLOS, an amendment to existing articles, or a UN General Assembly resolution? In the face of accelerating impacts of climate change, with little progress in mitigation of greenhouse gases by major emitters, it is essential that the rights of SIDS should be rapidly safeguarded and clarified, and any legal uncertainties dispelled. Failure to do so could create international tensions, given the economic implications both of fisheries and exploitation of seabed resources. A broader question arises on what should be done under the UN architecture to address the climate security interlinkages. The topic of climate change and security has been on the United Nations agenda for some time. Unquestionably, there is a strong interlinkage between UN efforts on development, peace and security, and climate change. Efforts to advance on one pillar are linked to progress made on the other. Adverse climate change impacts can set us back on both. I recall when I held the position of permanent representative of Tonga to the United Nations in 2008, the Pacific countries were already discussing the need to bring the topic to the Security Council. I clearly recall the response we received at one of our very first meetings with a number of member states. Why do you want to take this to the Security Council? Do you want the peacekeepers to stop the water from going onto the islands? But we reaffirmed that this issue was important to us. It was a life or death issue. We were not successful in our attempt to place this issue to the attention of the Security Council, but were able to negotiate and submit a draft resolution entitled Climate Change and its Possible Security Implications, which was adopted by the General Assembly in 2009. In the same year, at its 40th Pacific Island Leaders Meeting, leaders recognized that climate change is a great challenge of our time, and adopted the Pacific Call for Climate Action. There has been a resurgence of attention to this question over recent months, including the role played by the Security Council and other organs of the United Nations. In January of this year, the Dominican Republic, under its Council presidency for the month, organized an open debate in the Security Council on addressing the impacts of climate-related disasters on international peace and security. The meeting attracted considerable interest. Over 80 member states debated the issue for more than 8 hours. The majority viewed climate change and security as an important issue that needed to be addressed. Several key points were made at the meeting. Firstly, climate change is a concrete and existential threat to humanity, and some developing nations are particularly vulnerable. Mitigating the impacts of climate-related disasters benefits global stability and conflict prevention. Secondly, the entire United Nations system needs to be engaged in climate change, starting with increasing its analytical capabilities to better understand climate fragility risks and formulate evidence-based response strategies. Thirdly, the United Nations Security Council specific role is to work on the security impacts of climate change and is complementary to the mandate and actions of the UNFCCC and other UN bodies. The climate security nexus should feature regularly in the Council and that there should be regular briefings on climate risks and progress made. And fourth, the Small Island Developing States called for the appointment of a UN Secretary General's Special Envoy on Climate Change and Security. However, as back in 2008, a few delegations questioned whether the Security Council engagement was appropriate, citing knowledge gaps and doubts concerning the link between climate change and security. Some argued the Council should focus more on political issues directly relevant to conflicts, given its specific mandate as opposed to that of the General Assembly and the UNFCCC. Since that meeting, some progress has been made. The United Nations has developed an integrated risk assessment framework to analyze climate-related security risks. It has also set up an informal interagency group of the UN system entities to share information on ongoing work and promote collaboration. At the level of member states, a group of Friends on Climate and Security, which was set up in 2018 and co-chaired by Germany and the Republic of Nauru, has seen its membership grow to more than 40 countries from all of the UN's 5 regional groups. Germany will occupy a non-permanent Security Council seat in 2020 and has already announced that climate change and security will be a priority agenda item, a topic which it had promoted the last time it held the position in July 2011. Thus, there is hope that progress can be made in addressing the climate change, peace, and security nexus, especially as it is related to exacerbating existing conflicts or even tensions arising from increased competition over scarce critical natural resources. Failure to do so will mean a less effective UN response to existing crises where climate change is a threat multiplier and possible failure to prevent new conflicts from arising due to climate-related stresses. But what of the loss of land and displacement facing SIDS? If climate change remains unchecked, these issues will pose existential threats, the submerging of entire islands, and challenges to sovereignty, state integrity, and national identity. In 2013, parties to the Climate Change Convention established the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage to address loss and damage associated with the impacts of climate change, including extreme weather events and slow onset events in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, was a strong proponent of the mechanism, which they had hoped would provide support on risk management, manage financial risks associated with climate-related extreme weather events, and create an international insurance pool to be funded by developed countries to compensate vulnerable developing countries from uninsured loss and damage. There's been no agreement or progress in international climate talks on financial compensation. Work to date under the mechanism has focused on the first 2 issues. So we are left with the conclusion that there has been no satisfactory solution to the impacts of climate change facing vulnerable nations. Financial and technical support for adaptation has fallen far short of the mark. This will be essential to ensure that vulnerable countries build resilience to the negative impacts of climate change that are already taking place and will only become more intense and frequent. The response to address loss and damage from climate disasters has been in the form of humanitarian aid, which is little more than a Band-Aid solution. Countries attending the recent climate change meeting in Madrid did not agree on concrete actions related to slow onset events such as sea level rise, but instead set up an expert group to look at possible options. The climate-related security risks are adding a new dimension to already complex national development challenges. I would like to end by emphasizing that there would be no need to address the climate change security interlinkages if we had been able to put a brake on our greenhouse gas emissions back in the early 1990s, when the international scientific community had first agreed that human beings were disrupting climatic conditions through greenhouse emissions. The message is as clear now as it was then. And I think we have run out of time. We've run out of time long time ago to respond to this. There is a great urgency to arrest greenhouse gas emission and invest heavily in adaptation in the most vulnerable nations. The consequences are already severe, and the unthinkable is on our doorstep. We have run out of time. In fact, we ran out of time many years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Utoikamanu. When we were looking at Keynote, who might deliver the keynote today for this conference, we couldn't think of anybody better than Ambassador Utoikamanu, given her long experience and her leadership on these issues. We have just a few minutes for questions, and the ambassador was gracious enough to agree to a couple of questions. I have lots, but I want to make sure that to give people a chance. So woman in the back and gentleman up front, let's take 2 questions.
Thank you. I'm Chi Ninh Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. You made a statement clearly that by 2050, South Vietnam will be submerged under the water if we do nothing now. And not only that, all other small islands would be affected. And right now, you say that we need to mitigate the carbon dioxide emissions since 1990. What would you suggest to do now for the people in the US, in Vietnam, in China, and in India? There was talking about carbon tax. Do you think that's a good suggestion?
Thank you. Gentleman up front.
Hi, Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. So I've been to Bangladesh 15 times since 2008. And what I've learned from them is basically one question: why don't we make climate change and solutions to climate change and education curriculum, all the way up from 3rd grade? We absolutely don't. And it is interesting that 3 months ago, when there was a Girls' Education Summit at Brookings, the education director of UNICEF said this year he's only looking for transformational work. So would it not be possible for you to go over to UNICEF and basically turn, we have all these summits where people talk to each other, but it doesn't end up as a product which then becomes an education curriculum that teachers.
So your question specifically is about why don't we have it as part of educational curricula
Wouldn't that be a more effective way of achieving things than spending all the money on talks and having no money that goes to education?
Thank you. So 2 questions. One is, what should we do now? You talked about the urgency. What do we need to do now by India, US, China, and there was somebody else? And South Vietnam. About Vietnam. And secondly, what are your thoughts about having an educational curriculum to talk about and to be able to, so that we can speak the same language, I guess, right, on climate change and the relationship to security?
Well, thank you for those questions. I think what is important to appreciate is that the climate change and impacts is a global issue. And therefore the response, appropriate response to it will have to be undertaken at a global level, and the intergovernmental process that has been taking place in Madrid at a COP and others. It will, include political commitments by all countries concerned, the developing countries as well as the developed countries, to limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think that is quite an important political commitment, and then and then others follow through with the operationalization of that and its impact on policies and other decisions in government. With regards to the curriculum, I know that in the part of the region that I come from in the Pacific, climate change is part of the curriculum, so that children at a young age know what the issues are and how they can contribute to mitigating the negative impacts of climate change.
But the problem is that there's a tension between the least developed states and the most developed states, right? And that these the countries that you represent at the UN, they're the most vulnerable and also the least developed, which is a mutually reinforcing, debilitating, right, convergence of
Yes.
issues.
Well, for the most vulnerable groups of countries that I work across, the least developed, landlocked, and small island, 91 states, they're at the forefront of the impact of climate change, and they contribute the least towards the issue. But also they because of their country situation, they don't have the means to really deal with the impacts. So I guess the part of the tension is the responsibility for providing the finance to deal with the impacts of climate change, whether it's mitigation or in adaptation.
How much did you feel the U.S. absence in Madrid? High level absence.
Well, I'm not. I was not part. The UN is not part of the intergovernmental process, so we were not in the room in the negotiations. But we were. I was there to support particularly the least developed countries and the small island developing states. So my part was focusing on how we can progress on the loss and damage, and then also how we can provide support to these countries in drawing and submitting the NDC report, which is due next year.
Thank you. I'll take one more question. Over here. Gentleman with the glasses in the fourth row.
Hi, I'm Fernando Batista, formerly World Bank Global Environment Department. And I have a question about the Marshall Islands. And the reason, I'd like to find out why you didn't put in your security paradigm why the problem with Ruined Island is not mentioned. Because that is, that's the cap where the concrete cap is covering the radioactive material that the United States buried into the ground in the actually 60s, 70s. And I don't know if you could give us a little light on that.
Why the ambassador didn't mention the Marshall Islands?
And the dome,
Mm-hmm.
the concrete cap, that is eventually going to break probably by 2050 with a lot of
Well, that would be a security issue, wouldn't it? Do you represent the?
Yes. I'm from the Pacific, and having worked in the government for almost 30 years, we have been involved in considering the Marshall Islands situation, and I've also had bilateral talks with the president of the Marshall Islands on how the United Nations can support them with this particular issue, and so the relevant agencies in the UN are helping the Marshall Islands in looking at analysis and evaluation of the situation with the domes.
Thank you. Thanks, all of you, for your questions. And please join me in thanking Ambassador Utoika Manu for her wonderful keynote address.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.